Hi everyone, welcome to part 2. Okay, this was played by Nimzowitsch with white and Dr. Perlis in Ostend in 1907. Nimzowitsch had white and opened with e4. Then came e6, d4, d5, the French defense, and we saw the classical line with knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, and now de4, knight e4, bishop e7, bishop takes f6, g takes f6, and we see the aforementioned pawn structure with f7, f6, and e6. Play continued knight f3, knight d7, queen d2, rook g8. This creates immediate pressure, but it may have been wiser to delay it for a little while. So castle's long, knight f8, this is to protect h7, c4, c6, g3, queen c7, bishop g2, b6, rook h e1, bishop b7, king b1, and now black castles long. And Nimzowitsch felt here that Dr. Perlis had skillfully made the most of the defensive resources of the pawn complex thus far. Soon will come the moment where he should use the doubled pawns as a weapon of attack also. So next we saw knight c3, king b8, queen e3. This move is evidence of the fact that white not having the e5 square as an outpost makes his play a lot more cramped and difficult. So knight g6, this defends, e5 also, and thus black is ready to play f5 and f4 without having to worry about a knight landing on e5. So h4, f5, now knight d5, and Nimzowitsch was happy to be able to play this move. Black didn't exchange, but instead continued with f4. And after queen f3, to defend the bishop, because the threat was if white took, then taking on e5 and taking on g2. So knight takes e5, d takes e5, f takes g3, f takes g3, now bishop b4. And at this stage, Nimzowitsch felt that black had already equalized. So a3, bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, c5, bishop takes b7, queen takes b7, rook d6, rook d6, e d6, rook d8, rook d1, queen e4 check, king a2, rook d7, and a draw was agreed a couple of moves later. So it was a good example of the right way to utilize the pawn structure in question. Now we'll see a less convincing attempt for balance. This was played by Yates with white against Holland at a tournament in Scheveningen in 1913. Yates opened with e4, and we saw again a classical French defense. The same as the last time. And now the unusual bishop takes f6 at this point. So gf6, knight takes e4, doesn't really matter, it's unusual, but at least at the same position. And now f5, advancing immediately, which in Nimzowitsch's view is far too early to do it. As we saw in the previous game, continuing instead with b6, bishop b7, knight d7, queen c7, castling long is more in accordance with the needs of the position. So now came knight c3, bishop g7, and it's important to note that the bishop is the guard of the e5 square, but the f6 pawn in the last example performed this job much more efficiently. So knight f3, now castles. An alternative is knight c6 to increase the pressure on d4. White can play bishop b5, protecting the pawn, so castles, bishop c6, bc6, now queen d3, intending after rook b8, castling long, where any attempts by black to create an attack should be thwarted by white's playing knight e5. For example, queen e7, knight e5, queen b4, b3, and black doesn't really have very much going on here. So castles instead. So bishop c4, and this was wrong in Nimzowitsch's view. Needed instead, he felt, was queen d2, followed up with castling long. So bishop c4, and now b6, which was another weak move. Better was knight c6, and if white plays knight e2 to defend the pawn, then comes e5, d takes e5, knight e5, knight e5, bishop e5, c3, bishop e6, and the board is opened up nicely for the bishops, and black is well placed here. So b6, queen d3, bishop b7, castles long, knight d7, rook he1, queen f6, king b1, rook a d8, queen e3, and c5, which was a mistake in Nimzowicz's view. Better, he felt, was c6, preventing any progress for white's d-pawn, completely tying it down, and following up with b5 and then knight b6. What's important to note here is that playing f5 has not been effective in the position. The pawn mass didn't become an instrument of attack. On the contrary, white will soon have ideas of playing g4 in order to open attacking lines himself. So c5, now d5, e5, and g4. Here it is. At this point, Nimzowitsch felt that the game departed the realms of exact calculation. In any event, white should be happy that he has created a passed pawn. Against the strong pawns on e5 and f5, it would be appropriate to aim for a restraining maneuver with something like knight d2 and f3. Sorry, this knight to d2 and then f3. After which, white would be doing well enough. In fact, here play continued with f takes g4, knight g5, bishop h6, knight c e4, queen g6, f4, ef4, queen f4, and the game has become hugely complicated. Modern day engines actually give black as slightly better here, but white eventually went on to win after some further mistakes from black. However, the important lesson to take from what we've seen is that black couldn't make good use of his doubled pawn complex as an attacking force, and that he advanced it too early and without provocation, which you shouldn't do, because your opponent is trying to provoke you into advancing. Okay, so now we can look at the other double pawn complex outlined earlier. First, we'll look at it as an instrument of attack. This game was played between Tekman and Bernstein at St. Petersburg in 1914. Tekman opened with e4, then came e5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop b5, d6, d4, bishop d7, castles, bishop e7, rook e1, e4, knight d4, castles, bishop takes c6, bc6, and this creates a structure that we'll be looking at here, with doubled pawns on c7 and c6 and the open b file. So play continued b3, rook e8, bishop b2, now bishop f8. Black is playing to restrain white from playing e5, so he's playing to control this square. So queen d3, g6, rook ad1, bishop g7, now f3, which is slightly passive. He can play more aggressively with f4, but this is also weakening. So queen b8 in preparation for the c5 push, with the idea that the c4 is going to create some tactical problems for the bishop on b2 facing the queen. So bishop c1 getting out of the line of sight. And now queen b6. And also possible, according to Lasker, was a5 threatening a4. And if white plays a4, then c5. And if knight bd5, then bishop c6, and followed up with knight d7, and a nice game. So queen b6, knight a4, queen b7, knight b2, c5, knight e2, bishop b5, c4, bishop c6, and now knight c3. And against an open b-file, the queenside pawns for white here would usually be subjected to an attack with a5 and a4 to create a weak pawn on b3 or on a2 if he takes, but he usually shouldn't do that. And so Tekman has played specifically to prevent that. So knight d7, bishop e3, knight b6, and this is to support a5 and a4. These two knights here means that a4 can't be played, and this is going to give up his dark squared bishop, but he shouldn't do that because it's just too weakening for the king. Rook b1, a5, bishop f2, and black should follow up with something like queen c8, and then a4. If knight d5 comes, then simply knight takes d5, c takes d5, bishop d7, and a4 on the next move. And white doesn't really have much here, other than the possibility of playing knight d5, which in this instance was quickly neutralized. The important observations to make in the position are that by playing c6 and d5, black frees the d5 square for white to use, and therefore it's a double-edged idea, as it also creates play for black. However, if certain preconditions are met, such as the restraint of the e4 pawn, and a good counter to any knight d5 moves from white, such as we saw here, then the advance to c5 may be justified. The setup white elected for on the queen side here is solid, but it requires too many pieces to give white realistic winning chances. Lasker and Schlechter played this position a few times in their match, and it had drawish tendencies. Playing instead d6 to d5 in these structures is considered bad by Nimzowitsch, as it makes annoying restraining maneuvers possible. We can have a look at such a position in the next game. So this is another of Bernstein's games with the black pieces against Billikard this time. So Billikard opened with e4, and we saw the same opening sequence more or less up to this point. And now the move that Nimzowitsch considered bad, which is d5. So Billikard pushed in response to this. He played e5. So knight e8, and now queen d2. White is unafraid of the advancing of the doubled pawns here, because he understands how it will weaken the black position. So after c5, knight d2, c6, now rook a d1, queen c7, and knight f4, and there's no need to worry about queen takes e5 or knight takes d5. Is simply winning for white, and this threat exists anyway to fork the bishop and the queen. Just knight takes, and after the queen moves, take on e7, the queen has to take, and then d7 is dropping. So Bernstein played queen b7, and now knight a4, and the idea of this move, as we'll see, is to create a blockade on the c5 square, which would have been even more crushing had the c-pawns been a square further back. A knight on c5 in such a position would have a paralyzing effect. In this game we can see the affinity between restraint and doubled pawns that was looked at earlier in the chapter. So play continued c4, bishop d4, c takes b3, and a takes b3. Slightly surprising, perhaps better was c takes b3, capturing away from the center, which is against general principles, but it further emphasizes the c5 square and the c-file. So a takes b3, now knight c7, knight d3, knight e6, and we can see what white's doing here. So knight dc5, queen c7, knight d7, queen d7, queen e3, knight d4, queen d4, rook a b8, knight c5, queen f5, and knight d3. And white has nice control of c5 and a clear strategy for the game, which would have been all the more stronger if he had opened the c-file when given the chance with c takes b3 instead. So such an approach by white appears to completely refute the early d5 push from black. Nimzowitsch closes this section by emphasizing that it's often very effective to create a blockade against the doubled pawn structure that we looked at here, even if it means undoubling the pawns in the process. The aforementioned link between doubled pawns and restraint becomes very clearly felt, and as we start to understand the principles better, we should be able to develop very strong strategical or positional play as a result. Now we'll look at the issue of restraint, with emphasis on so-called mysterious rook moves, as well as further exploration of freeing moves, which we have looked at already. Nimzowitsch opens this section by recalling a time when many critics attacked his ideas. In particular, he says, some critics preyed on his rook moves and referred to them as mysterious. Of course, these critics did not know they were mocking the man who would go on to become one of the most prestigious and influential chess authors of all time. We can see an example of such a mysterious rook move here. From the position, it's clear that white wants to play d4. It's the logical push that his pieces are geared towards, and he wants to advance the weak d3 pawn, lest it becomes a target. With this in mind, the move rook e8 makes the freeing push d4 less desirable for white to play, because after e takes d4, the rook will be occupying the open file, and in this particular position, facing the queen also. So this rook move, rook e8, which is mysterious because the rook is not moving to an open file, has a preventative and prophylactic effect. Nimzowitsch points out that asking a piece simply to attack is the attitude of a wood pusher or a coffee house player. Stronger chess minds also want their pieces to play preventative roles, and that's what the rook is doing in this position. As mentioned, it means that the logical freeing move white is hoping to play will open a file for black, which he cannot force open himself. The possibility that the file could become open is reason enough to occupy it, as it may well be possible later to make our opponent regret his freeing move. At the very least, it will mean our opponent has to take further preparations before playing the said freeing move. So the mysterious rook move is, in fact, part of the framework of a rational strategy. Nimzowitsch stresses that if we want to learn as students, we should practice such moves and make an effort to psychologically combat the notion that it's only worth employing rooks actively and on open files. He felt that the prevention of freeing moves was much more important than whether a rook at any given moment is an active or passive piece. Here's an example. So, what do you play here with white? If you want to have a think, then stop the video now. Okay, so it's pretty easy, this one. The answer is rook f d1, with the reasoning that black should be aiming to play c5, and if that's played, he can continue with d takes c5, after which he'll have pressure on the hanging c and d pawns that will be on open files. And as before, the rook moves to a closed file as a preventative measure. So these mysterious rook moves generally take place in the opening, but they do also occur at the beginning of the middle game. For instance, here it should be clear that white has the strategical aim of a3, b4 and c5. So with that in mind, black can now play rook a7, with the point that if a3 comes rook f a8, and it's clear that white can only implement his plan through simultaneously making positional concessions. For example, queen b2, queen d8, b4, ab4, ab4. Black has the a file, and he can now play queen b8. So if rook a7, then queen a7, and he retains control of the file. So rook fb1, as I said, rook a7, queen a7, this is looking good for black. So rook fb1, king f8, c5, bc5, rook a7, bc5, queen b2, rook b2. Now rook a3, and we see the strength of the a file immediately. So rook c2, and now bishop c8, and c6 is best according to Nimzowitsch. If instead cd6 and cd6, knight b5, rook a1 check, king f2, and bishop a6, and black is equal at worst. So c6, and now knight e8, and black can play f5 next with some counterplay. Okay, so we've seen the idea illustrated with some schematics. Now let's have a look at some actual gameplay examples. This was played between Abraham Kupchik with white and the great Jose Raul Capablanca with black. We won't pay too much attention to the opening stages because it's not of interest in relation to what we're looking at, and we'll also flip the board so we can see it from Capablanca's point of view. So we had a Queen's Indian kind of approach, although white hasn't played c4, so it's slightly different, and black's clearly playing to control e4, and white hasn't taken action to prevent that, so black focuses on that entirely. It's clamped completely on e4 here, and he doesn't mind about weakening e5. So knight e5, castles f3, knight d2, bishop d2. Now more pieces come off. Rook a1, c5, queen d1, rook f6, queen e2, rook a f8, bishop b5, queen c7, f4, c4, king h1, bishop d6, and now rook f3. Okay, so at this point we can start taking a closer look. If we recall the chapter on pawn chains, we can see one in existence here with a d5, c4, d4, and c3. Therefore black should be aiming for a6, b5, and b4 to attack the pawn chain at its base. However, it's necessary to secure the king side with some prophylaxis first. White would like to play g4 in order to open lines, and Capablanca comes up with an instructive approach. If you want to have a consideration about what could be played here in order to utilize the prophylaxis against white, then stop the video now. Okay, so h5 is the first move, locking down on g4, and after rook ef1, rook h6, the aforementioned mysterious rook move. Kappa has seen that white wants to play h3 and g4, and this move should discourage him from doing so considerably, as black would immediately have the open h-file to his credit. So play continued, bishop e1, g6, bishop h4, and it's interesting to note too that black has created huge dark square weaknesses in his position, but Capablanca of course was one of the greatest positional players of all time, and his understanding is second to none. He has correctly evaluated that the weaknesses are hugely compensated through the fact that his overall grip on the position is solid. So king f7, another nice positional move, is protecting weaknesses and enabling the doubling of rooks if and when it's necessary. So queen e1 and now a6. Having taken the right precautions on the king side, he can begin his attack on the queen side. And this is something that, you know, even strong club players neglect to do. They focus too much on what they're trying to do and not on stopping what their opponent is trying to do, which obviously is equally if not more important. So bishop a4, b5, bishop d1, bishop c6, rook h3. Kupchak wants to attack, but he should be defending his queen side first. So now comes a5, bishop g5, rook h8, queen h4, b4, and this, you know, isn't fearless, but cool and clear. White has nothing here on the king side. So queen e1, rook b8, rook hf3, now a4, and this attack proved to be decisive, with white resigning after a further 9 moves. Rook 3 f2, a3, b3, cb3, bishop b3, bishop b5, rook g1, queen c3, bc3, rook c2, rook hc8, bishop h4, bishop d3, rook cc1, and now rook takes b3. Very nice finishing shot. Exchange sack. After a takes b3, a2, and white is helpless here and resigned. So it was a great game, and the point that we must take from it is Capablanca's rook maneuver. Rook f6, h6, h8. The mysterious rook moves that discourages the opponent from opening files. It was also an instructive example of the importance of prophylaxis before beginning an attack, i.e. ensuring your opponent doesn't have counterplay. So here's another example from one of Nimzowicz's own games. Here he had black against Hermann von Gottschall at a tournament in Hanover in 1926. Von Gottschall opened with e4, and we saw a French defense with bishop d3, the Schlechter variation, which is not so common nowadays. So c5, c3, d4, bishop e4, knight f6. As with the previous game, I'm not going to go through the opening with much analysis until we get to the point of interest. So bishop f3, knight bd7, knight d2, bishop e7, and so on. Now knight b6, black has given white an isolated queen's pawn. Now he's going to set up a blockade in typical Nimzowitsch style, although it was kind of short-lived for a blockade. Queen b7, rook c1, rook d8, like so. Now we saw mass exchanges, and this is only the beginning of the simplification. Next came knight c3, rook a5, rook fd1, and like this. And you know, whilst optically this might look drawish, there's still lots of play to be had in the position. So rook c5, dc5, bishop c6, f3, f6, king f2, king f7, rook d4, a5, and g3, which is a slight error. It would have been better to stabilize the light squares, first of all with b3 to prevent a4. So despite the shortage of material, Nimzowitsch is now able to create play. It's a great example of a master creating something out of nothing. Play continued a4, f4, h5, and h3. Okay, so it's black to play. What would you consider here? Again, if you want to try and guess, then stop the video now. Rook h8 is the answer, a great mysterious rook move. The point, of course, is that it prevents white from playing g4, which would open the h-file for black. Even in these simplified positions, we should still be thinking about prophylaxis. So rook d1, king g6, rook d4, king f5. And now we see some of the benefit of having prevented the g4 push. The black king is very active here and now takes over from the rook as the guardian of the g4 push. So bishop d2, and again, what would you play in this position? Rook f8 is what Nimzowitsch played. Another mysterious rook move, although it's not quite the same as the ones we've seen already. On the contrary, it's an active posting, as black is interested in playing e5 here, in part to open the f-file for his rook. So bishop e1, now e5, fe5, fe5. This creates a passed pawn that ultimately is going to win black the game. So rook h4, g5, and rook b4. If rook takes, then king g6 with discovered check is winning the rook. So rook b4, king e6 with check from the rook, king e2, e4, bishop f2, rook f3. And from here, the combined factors of the passed pawn, the powerful rook on f3, and the weak c5 pawn together brought about the slow collapse of the white position. A very nice endgame from Nimzowitsch, who finished this section with a summary. The mysterious rook move involves placing our rook on a closed file that can only be opened by our opponent. If our opponent does not open the file, then the rook is wasting its time where it is. Such a move should never be played without being aware that you're sacrificing a certain effectiveness. This sacrifice is made in order to prevent a freeing action from your opponent, or at least to render such a move more difficult. We have to take special care to judge properly whether any freeing move planned by our opponents is indeed a genuine freeing move, because if it's not, then it would be highly uneconomical to make this said sacrifice of a rook's activity. As an example of these false and genuine freeing moves, we can have a look at a game that Nimzowitsch played against Blackburn in St. Petersburg in 1926. We'll get to that in a second. We'll just have a look at the final moves of this game first. So rook b6, and now king e5, rook b4, king d5, and now h4, and a zugzwang position had been achieved in which white had to give ground somewhere. So play continued like this. And from here the win isn't too difficult. Continued as follows. And resigns. So a very nice game from Nimzowitsch, and a great example of the mysterious rook move which we saw twice there. Okay, that's the end of part 2.